Hello lovelies, it's me, Bitter Corella, and I'm here back in this bullshit because I filmed a whole video and then because of technical glitches, it's all gone. So I gotta do the whole thing all over again. And so here we go. Oh, right, we're here to discuss more dark tomes by dark writers. Alright, blah blah blah. Here's the bit where we ask the orb which dark writer we're going to be talking about today. And of course, I actually don't need to ask the orb because since I'm redoing this, of course, I already know which one we're talking about. It's summertime, so let's talk about someone who writes for the kids. Someone making some deliciously dark stories for the wee ones. In fact, let's talk about John Bellairs. Often, when you think about kids' horror books, you think about R.L. Stine or Christopher Pike, both great horror writers in their own right. But if you're my age, you may have come of age reading the horror of a fellow named John Bellairs. And he's got a very different style. I've always thought of R.L. Stine books as having the feel of campfire tales, and Christopher Pike has the sense, his stories feel like they are urban legends that you would hear whispered in a school locker room. John Bellairs, in contrast, has a very boys' adventure yarn feel to it, so you'd almost feel like his story should be serialized in the back of Boys' Life magazine. So your typical John Bellairs book is usually about some boys investigating an occult mystery and poking into an abandoned manor house or castle or crypt in order to find some missing MacGuffin or other, during which they're menaced by supernatural baddies. It's pretty basic adventure yarn type stuff, but John Bellairs' real innovation was marrying that basic boys' adventure narrative with straight up gothic horror. Now, the fact that it's about kids on magical adventures, I think does invite a rather natural comparison to another very popular series of books about kids on magical adventures, by which I mean the Harry Potter books. They are very different beasts, but since they do have that, they do have something, feel like something of a natural comparison, so I'll talk about that a little bit, even though I'm sure I will speak of J.K. Rowling at some point in another video, even though she isn't really a dark author, but I've got words to say about her. But anyway, what is funny about John Bellairs is it seems that his work is less challenged than that of Rowling, which is funny because all the dark things that parents kept worrying were in Harry Potter actually are in John Bellairs. I mean, Potter is pretty innocuous fluff, but when you read John Bellairs' books, you get actual dark magic, occultism, human sacrifice, all the things that angry NIMBYs were claiming kids were learning from the Harry Potter books. Now, part of the reason that John Bellairs seems to have gotten less flack is probably because of those very prim and proper Edward Gorey illustrations that originally went with his books. It really helps make them go down a little easier, because you look at it and you think like, oh, it's very stately and refined, just like that mystery series on PBS. And it makes parents kind of just lulls them into a false sense of security, since they're mostly going to be distracted by, gorier illustrations, like in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. So let's get right into it. What are some common features of the Bellairs story? Number one, magic is normal. Now, In contrast to Harry Potter, where magic exists in its own separate wainscot society, walled off from our life, so the wizards are always like, no, can't let the muggles know about this. It's a weird situation that requires increasing mental gymnastics as that series goes along. But in John Bellairs' books, magic is just an ordinary thing that ordinary people can do. It's not easy. In fact, it takes a lot of study to do magic, but with the right amount of elbow grease, anyone can do it, which is a big difference between it and Harry Potter, which is a world where you need to have special blood to do magic, which is also kind of funny because it also makes you think like, well, you'd think parents would be more mad about John Bellairs because he's basically telling you like, yeah, if you study hard enough, you can do magic too. Unlike Harry Potter, which is just telling kids like, sorry, you ain't got the midichlorians. You're out of luck. In fact, in one of the series, the Louis Barnevelt books, Louis's uncle Jonathan is a warlock who actually earned his warlock degree through a correspondence school. And it's a recurring motif through all his books that people in the know, educated men, of course know that magic is real. It's just, the hoi polloi, the laity. They just assume it's not real. They just assume it's all fake. Another interesting thing about John Bellairs' magic is that in John Bellairs' books, magic and religion are not mutually exclusive. Now, nowadays, we generally think of religion and magic as being sort of diametrically opposed. We kind of see it through that lens of post-Renaissance Christianity, where the idea of magic is something that is always frowned upon by religion and something completely separate, just a domain of charlatans and diabolicals. But in John Bellairs, there's actually quite a bit of crossover. In The Curse of Blue Figurine, the villain is a literal Catholic priest who's decided to dabble in the dark arts. And in Eyes of the Killer Robot, the day is saved by an incantation by a specifically Muslim wizard. So in John Bellairs' books, not only are religion and magic overlapping categories, but there is no one religion which has monopoly on functioning magic. Number 2, serious-minded kids paired with wacky adults. This is the most noticeable thing about the John Bellairs formula. Generally, he'll have a kid who's kind of serious, kind of thoughtful, generally kind of a nerd, and he pairs him with a wacky, eccentric, almost childlike adult. So in the Louis Barnevelt series, Louis is paired with his goofy Uncle Jonathan. Anthony Munday hangs out with crotchety librarian Miss Ells. And Johnny Dixon, of course, is helped by the cantankerous Professor Roderick Childermass. And of course, this is sort of a winning formula. It does make sense because, of course, Bellairs probably figured like, well, these are the adults that kids will most be in tune with, most sympathize with. But there's also something I've heard horror for kids described as one of the few non-didactic genres for children. Generally, children's media is very concerned with imparting moral lessons, helping children grow up to be upstanding moral adults. Horror is a little different because it generally involves kids acting against what society has determined is good. Or rather, kids will have to go against the rules of society in order to defeat the evil. And therefore, things that are normally in kids' literature kind of frowned upon are reframed as heroic in horror. Kids are able to, kids who are naughty are sometimes exactly what's needed to save the day. This happens a lot in John Bellairs' books because so many of his books involve trespassing, breaking and entering, and stealing magical artifacts. Things that normally no adult would endorse at all. things that normally parents would be aghast that they were letting their kids read about. But in horror, since it's being used to defeat ghosts and vampires, it's a little different. It's a little more acceptable. To that end, very often in children's horror media, if they're adults are usually absent or actively antagonistic, and the only adults that might appear as helpers to the children are those who are also somewhat outside the bounds of society, considered eccentric weirdos. Now that happens, I could name a few examples outside of Bellairs. Gravity Falls has Grunkle Stan, Flapjack has Captain Knuckles. If you want to think about more traditional horror, then just think about, Gary Busey and Silver Bullet. But the adults that we have in John Bellairs, I think, are some of the best examples of that phenomenon. In fact, sometimes they're so eccentric, they're kind of annoying. I mean, I gotta say, Professor Childermas just gets on my nerves eventually, just because he's such a crank. But Uncle Jonathan, he's a lovable dude. I like Uncle Jonathan. Number 3, real-life kids' problems. Now, it's kind of interesting because John Bellairs did not originally start out to be a children's writer. One of his first books was The Face in the Frost, which was his tribute to the fiction of J.R.R. Tolkien. He decided he was going to write a story about a wizard, but try and make it so, unlike Gandalf, who was kind of a plot device, he was going to try and imbue his wizard with a little more personality. That book got some attention, and so John Bellairs thought he'd go lean a little less into the fantasy, a little more into the horror, but it turned out there was not a market for contemporary urban horror at that point in the 60s. So some friends of his suggested, why don't you retool your idea and turn it into a kid's book? So he went ahead and did that. Now, I think that's interesting because John Bellairs actually has a very natural flair for kids' writing. Because his writing, not only does it have ghosts and ghouls and all sorts of gothic monsters, it also has very normal, mundane problems that kids have to deal with. And these problems really form the backbone of his stories. All the monsters are sort of just kind of extra window dressing trappings after that. I think the best example of this is in one of his most popular books, The House with a Clock in Its Walls. Now, in this book, our hero, Louis Barnevelt, has just begun attending a new school, and he's feeling kind of lonely. He doesn't have any friends, but he meets someone named Tarby. Tarby is a popular kid, very sporty, very outgoing. Everybody loves Tarby. Unfortunately, Tarby has broken his arm and he's in a sling, so he's been benched for the season from the sports. So he and Louis, since they're both benched, they actually start hitting it off and become fast friends. And this lasts for a little while, but once Tarby's arm is healed and he's once again in the sports, he loses interest in his friendship with Louis. Louis is so disturbed by this that he decides he's going to do anything to keep Tarby's friendship, even invoking an evil undead wizard back from the dead in a kind of not very well thought out attempt to get Tarby's attention. Now, one of the important things about this is Tarby is not portrayed as a bad kid at all. He's just a normal kid. And in fact, when they adapted The House with the Clock on Its Walls as a movie, they thought, well, audiences aren't going to understand this, so let's make Tarby into an asshole. So I really didn't like that. In fact, that was my biggest complaint about the adaptation because it really destroyed the heart of what Bellairs was getting at. A lot of writers tend to romanticize childhood friendships. They say, oh, you have your best friendships in childhood. The friendships that you form when you're younger are more intense. They're more real. They last a lifetime. And in fact, that's not really always the case. Very often, people you're friends with in childhood, you're just friends with them because they're around, because it's convenient, and you're lonely. And very often, those friendships do not stand the test of time. And it's not because anyone is bad. It's not because they're bad people. It's just because you're different. And that's really what's happening here with Lewis and Tarby. So I really appreciate that John Bellairs doesn't really romanticize childhood emotions. He understands that they're very intense. They feel extremely melodramatic and real, and every disagreement, every argument you have with your friends when you're a kid feels so incredibly extra. But looking at it from the comfortable vantage point of adulthood, you realize, oh, not so much. Anyway, but that's one of the things that I've always really appreciated that about John Bellairs' writing. To that same point, it's kind of interesting that even though these are obviously stories for boys, these are boy stories. There are female characters in them. Florence Zimmerman in the Louis Barnevelt books is a treasure. She is a snarky, sassy joy, and I love her to death. And of course, there's also Miss Ells in the Anthony Munday series, who's a cantankerous bitch. Oh, we love her. But that said, these are very clearly stories that are aimed at boys, all about boys' adventures and boys' life. But they are very different from a lot of literature aimed at boys that I remember growing up. Now, I don't know how things are now. I haven't read any kid stories that are coming out now. I haven't read any of the Minecraft books or Wimpy Kid. I don't know what the kids are reading now. Whatever. It's probably bad because young people have terrible taste. But when I was a kid, pretty much most stories, most books that were aimed at boys were written by authors who were either very sporty themselves or assumed, well, if I'm writing for young boys, boys like sport, so let's talk about sport. That was a recurring theme in most boys' literature. It was all about how they loved playing sport until they went out on an adventure which would interrupt their sport playing, and which they hoped they could finish in order to go and return to their sport playing. So sport was like a big thing. It was the thing that assumed, the one thing that boys were allowed to like back then. Times have changed, of course. Now you're allowed to like video games too, I understand. And that's fine. I'm sure sporty boys like reading adventure stories just as much as unsporty boys. But what I like about John Bellairs' writing is that his characters are all explicitly not sport. Louis Barnevelt is described as a fat klutz. Anthony Munday is kind of a reedy dweeb who can't get along with other kids his own age. And Johnny Dixon is a nearsighted hypochondriac. Anyway, I really appreciate that because when I was a kid, I liked to read, but a lot of the books that I read featured, I was hard to relate because I was not a sporty kid. That may surprise you. I was not particularly traditionally masculine as a child. So I found John Bellairs' books a little more relatable than a lot of others. Number 4, Dirty Magic. Now, John Bellairs had a very obvious interest in folklore mythology, and he obviously did a lot of research into world legends from which he drew to write these books. Now, again, in contrast to, say, Harry Potter, where you could just do magic by waving around a wand and saying a few magic words, John Bellairs' books are all about getting your hands dirty with nasty ingredients. If you're going to do dark magic, you're going to have to really get into it. So a lot of these books involve really nasty magical procedures. For example, in The Eyes of the Killer Robot, where the villain is literally scooping out people's eyes and using them to power his evil robot. These things get kind of grisly. In fact, it's actually kind of funny how little parents seem to have objected to Bellairs' writing, considering, he sometimes just basically gives you the recipes for evil magic. I mean, if you read House of the Clock and its Walls, he basically tells you how to make a hand of glory. Now, number 5, This one's a little harder to define, but I'm going to say it. I may be the only one who gets this feeling, but there's a certain very Catholic quality to John Bellairs' writing. And it's not that Catholicism has an especially large presence in these books. It does appear. Johnny Dixon goes to Catholic school. Like I mentioned in one of the books, we've actually got an evil Catholic priest as the villain. But this is more about tone. Now, there's a very very stolid Catholic feeling to these books, and it's not like in William Peter Blatty's books where it's all about reverential awe for the rightness of the one true church in Rome. Rather, with John Bellairs, it's a very intellectual, detached curiosity, and it feels like something that's probably the result of a Jesuit education, really. And I feel like I'm probably right on this because when I did a little bit of research into John Bellairs for this video, it mentioned that he was a graduate of Notre Dame, and his very first book was Saint Figida and Other Parodies, a series of satirical essays about Vatican II. So take that, Pope John the 23rd. Like I mentioned, John Bellairs' horror is very gothic. It involves a lot of atmosphere, a lot of spooky storms going on in the background while our heroes explore abandoned castles while by the light of a flickering candle. But that's not to say that John Bellairs can't get a little bit grisly as well. He is definitely not against some gore. Besides, you'll find a lot of descriptions of withered, desiccated mummies and corpses. He does not spare any expense in describing those. And there are also some pretty nasty things that happen. One of the things that really stuck with me when I read these as a kid is in The Mummy, the Will, and the Crypt. It's mentioned that some monster sucks a dog's face right off, so that when our heroes find the dog, it's literally just got a skull for a head, which is pretty intense. John Bellairs' writing feels very old-fashioned, and it's really interesting because he specifically sets the stories in the 1960s and 70s. Now, I feel that maybe John Bellairs realized that he had a very old-fashioned way of writing, and he knew that time would not stand still, and that in the future, children would probably be reading these on their space pods or something. And he was like, well, they're going to look at these stories now and find the adventures of Johnny Dixon a little old-timey. Well, I'm going to head them off at the pass and specifically write these as period pieces, which is an interesting, kind of an interesting track to take. It's not like these are particularly, it's not like these stories really feel out of date, though. They don't feel dated, even though they do take place in the 60s and 70s. And there are scattered mentions of things that would place them in that time period. For example, Johnny Dixon's dad is described as being a pilot in the Korean War. But in general, these feel as just as timely today as they did back when they were first written. It's not like... and it's not, even though they're set in 1960s, there isn't an overabundance of goofy period details. Like if they were written today, they'd probably like, Stranger Things it up, where everyone's just playing with a Rubik's Cube constantly or something like that. But there is a very old-fashioned, there's an old-fashionedness to John Bellairs. He feels like, the way that he writes feels very much like a C.S. Lewis or a J.R. Tolkien. You really get the sense that this is an academic fellow. This is a guy who probably spends all his time in some, university ivory tower. And, well, John Bellairs was an English professor before he became a writer, so you can sort of see a little bit of that attitude bleeding over into his writing. So to this day, I would say that John Bellairs remains probably one of the best writers of horror for children. He's a master of building suspense, just great at crafting atmosphere, and he's not afraid to get a little bit gory once in a while when it's really necessary. He does feel a little bit old-fashioned in his writing style, which may your mileage may vary on that. But all in all, I think he's definitely someone worth checking out. If you have kids and you want to introduce them to horror, you could do a lot worse than John Bellairs. Because not only is he like great, he's dead. So he can't disappoint you by being a TERF now. Like some people. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this little look at John Bellairs. If you have, why not click or push a thing to do the thing? You can, I guess, like it or subscribe. That's a thing. Or if you're watching us on public access television, then you can't do that. In which case, you should just check out our Twitter. It's Midnight Pals. Oh, sorry, Midnight_Pals. And we talk about John Bellairs there as well as other horror writers. So why not? What else are you going to do with your time? Anyway, until next time, I'm Bitter Corella, and please enjoy your mortal coils.
Ghostbusters.